Welcome to the North, everyone. Have you ever wanted to explore a fantasy version of the Norwegian wilderness? Meet the colorful inhabitants of this land? Get trampled by a moose or two? Or develop a very real case of arachnophobia? Well, have I got a game for you. Northern Journey is a Metroidvania-style first-person adventure game developed by the one-man army team that is Slid Studio. It is a very old-school little adventure that I personally found thoroughly entertaining from beginning to end, and just might be responsible for me recovering my faith in video games. But more on that later. First, what's it about? Well... You take control of a man who gets lost while exploring a fjord, and after his boat sinks and strands him near a rather peculiar village, he immediately finds employment for minimum wage. What is your salary? Your salary is a way out of here, of course. Entrusted with recovering the dimensional violators, you embark on a perilous journey through the uncharted wilderness, where you will endure the onslaught of the local fauna and suffer the attentions of supernatural entities. The story is, well, just kinda that. You're stranded, and if you want to unstrand yourself, you better help out the traveling flute player. This is very much not a narrative-heavy game. The objective is simple and the characters not many. And while I wouldn't say that the events that transpired are dull or uninteresting, quite the opposite in fact, you should know beforehand that it isn't the main focus of this adventure. Your character functions in a very old-school way, and that is by not being a character at all, merely an extension of the player themselves. You have no dialogue or choice in what you do. You're just a literally disembodied pair of arms that's trying very hard to make it to the end without getting killed. So, what about the rest of the cast? Are they any interesting? You bet they are. The cast of characters ranges from simply strange to very creepy. Interacting with them was to me one of the many highlights of the game, thanks to some clever writing and an offbeat sense of humor that I found very amusing. It's not laughing your ass off jokes, it's more chuckle like Paulie from The Sopranos kinda jokes. When they are not being comedic, they're treating you like shit. You are an outsider after all. Most characters are based around the starting area of the game, which you will find yourself revisiting thanks to the Metroidvania design. There's the village idiot, a policeman, two ladies who are definitely not witches, and a guy who didn't pay his taxes, among other colorful characters. They're all very odd looking and stand somewhat in contrast with the beautiful scenery, giving them an otherworldly look that, along with their dialogue, helps with creating an unsettling atmosphere. If there is one criticism I have of the characters in the game is that, around the last third or so, you simply stop meeting anyone. Your employer always keeps in touch, but for the most part what begins as a nice adventure with a memorable cast of characters ends up as quite a lonely affair. And while it does make narrative sense that no one lives near the more dangerous areas, you still end up missing these interactions. Like I said, the cast and the characters are not the main driving force of your adventure in this game. To really talk about Northern Journey when it's at its best, we need to talk about exploration. Despite not really being an epic role-playing game, you're accompanied at all times by an amazing sense of adventure that doesn't let go once it gets a grip on you. Each level has its own unique feel to it, with an ethereal and foreboding atmosphere, creative set pieces, tense enemy encounters, and what's best of all, very little hand-holding. There is no arrow, no compass, no quest markers, and while a rough map of each level is drawn in your journal after you are done with the area, there is no map with icons and objective text, only your journal with the overall goals of the adventure and perhaps some clues as to where to go next. Most sections of the game also have their own gameplay mechanics to take into account, so while the game could easily be described as a first-person adventure, in practice there are quite a few styles of gameplay that you can clearly tell the developer had a lot of fun experimenting with. Puzzle sections, platforming, horror set pieces, and even the least fun gliding level I've ever experienced are just some of the variations of the formula that you can find here. Despite being a mostly linear experience with some backtracking, exploration in Northern Journey flows in a very organic way, making the game feel way bigger and open than it really is. This is one of those games where the solution you need to move forwards will require you to learn every nook and cranny of some of these levels, and thankfully these are an absolute treat to explore. This game looks great. Individual textures might look rough from up close, but when they are all put together, thanks partly to the awesome level design, some areas honestly end up looking quite realistic. There are even some coming out of the cave moments that evoke similar scenes in games like Oblivion or Fallout 3, and honestly, despite the dev pulling the same trick a couple of times, it never got old. In the developer diary, the game's creator explains how they set out to create an adventure while using mostly personal experience as an inspiration for things like the setting, enemies, and weapons to name a few things. As a result, the overall look of the game is, as the youngsters of the internet would say, very crisp. It goes for an early 2000s RPG vibe, but a bit more grounded and natural. The textures, sound, and visual effects all have a very authentic quality to them. I actually find it kinda hard to express how well put together it all is. Despite the strange look of its inhabitants and any supernatural happenings you might experience, you come out of most levels of the game thinking that they could be a real place you can find in the Scandinavian wilderness. Then there's this thing for me, when a game's presentation, whether good or bad, absolutely nails a single, very particular thing, and I end up remembering that aspect in a different sensory way that isn't visual or auditory. That's probably a bit confusing, so I better think of some examples. Okay, Far Cry 2. A game that looked great in 2008 and still does nowadays, but I will always remember how the whole atmosphere of the game perfectly conveyed how hot it is in this place, you know? Way more so than other games set in similar environments. I also had that feeling with the First Division game. I've played many games based around cold, snowy environments, but it feels like it's really damn cold in the Division's New York. Okay, final example, The Witcher 3. Flawless presentation, right? Looks gorgeous everywhere, but I will always remember it as the first game where I noticed wind and how it affected the plants and the trees around you. And with the game world being so incredibly detailed, I honestly felt like I could close my eyes and feel that breeze on my face sometimes. So, what about Northern Journey? Well, you might think this sounds a bit weird, but I swear I can smell some parts of this game. If you've been to places with a similar climate to Norway, you'll get what I'm saying. That smell of recently fallen rain, fog, and wet ground and plants. I don't really know how else to explain it really, if you know, you know. Then there's the soundtrack, also composed by the developer and consisting of custom songs for each level. I love the music in this game. It is very unique and also shows the creator having fun and trying out different styles, while somehow at the same time making it all very cohesive and unintrusive. The soundtrack is there, it's just not front and center, just like all great adventure music. My favorite level in the whole game is the Green Slid, a trip through the mountains where you explore ancient ruins with some perilous platforming over an angry river, and a few zip lines that you can use later on when you revisit this section. And you will revisit it since, like all memorable Metroidvania levels, it acts as a nexus point for next and previous levels. If that already sounds pretty cool, well, let me play you the Green Slid song. Okay, now let's talk gameplay for a little while. Northern Journey's main gameplay elements are all based around the exploration of linear areas. You will be presented with obstacles that impede your progress, and the acquisition of a certain item or the demise of a certain enemy will be required. Despite their linearity, levels are quite open-ended when it comes to moving around and exploring. They are not overly complex and are designed in a way that it all looks like it's part of a particular region, but each section is made memorable by an array of landmarks. Whether it is with changes to the terrain itself, the addition of buildings, or by more direct means like having signs tell you what you can find down a certain path. Most levels are in one way or another dangerous, and even the more beautiful sections will have water for you to drown in or cliffs to fall from. So, what about combat? Well, believe it or not, Northern Journey is a first-person shooter, and while that might not sound all that strange, it is in the style of shooter where we can find the game's more contrasting feature. Many combat encounters in this game play in a similar way to an arena shooter. No, I'm not joking. Obviously, if I've been describing a chill adventure game where you solve puzzles and explore beautiful scenery, I have to explain why I'm comparing it to Quake now. Well, first of all, your character is fast. When I first started the game, I honestly thought my character's normal walking speed would be the fast one, and then I would have a button to walk around. Nope, sprinting is even faster. And you will need to be because enemies are also pretty fast. If they're not fast, they lunge or throw things at you. There's also usually more than a few of them. Then there's projectile speed. Northern Journey is an FPS with unconventional weapons, in the sense that you won't be using any sort of firearm. From bows to several types of crossbows, slingshots and some spears, all of your means of dealing damage are based around medieval weaponry of some kind. Well, most of them anyway. This means that none of your projectiles are going at bullet speed. So not only are you moving pretty fast and avoiding enemy attacks, you need to lead your own shots if you want to come out victorious. You might think that this approach to action stands somewhat in contrast with the rest of the game, and while that's true, it also works surprisingly well, thanks to clever enemy and weapon design. Enemies are one of the many things I mentioned that are unique and crafted specifically for each level, and while the dev's design philosophy leaves you fighting a lot of wildlife, and specifically a lot of insects, that doesn't mean they all look, sound, or attack the same. Spiders, for example. I wasn't joking at the beginning about arachnophobia. I'm pretty sure I've never played a game with this amount of spiders, and 100% sure no other game I've played has had this many varieties of creepy crawlers for you to kill. Enemies being unique to each area is also one of the many things that add to the sense of adventure that moves you forward and makes you feel that you need to see what's next. It could be something as simple as a bear, something supernatural, or natural but complex in the way it interacts with you. Let me show you by telling you about my favorite enemy in the game. And by favorite I mean I really fucking hated every section that involved them. There's an area called Sourwood where things seem relaxed at first, but you soon realize that the trees are hiding a fun surprise. These are giant ticks. They latch onto you and suck your blood, dealing massive damage. Once they are nice and fat, they retreat, and if you fail to kill them, they will start to give birth to additional ticks.
Oh, that's nasty.
This is good enemy design. We have the initial encounter that is likely to shock you because, unlike previous enemies, this one doesn't just hit you and moves on to charge at you again. But then, once you realize what their deal is, you're still tense and on your toes because unless you pay attention, you're gonna have a lot more to deal with that you can probably handle. They start off with a scary little gimmick, but still remain engaging every time you fight them. Not every encounter plays out at breakneck speed. It is mostly during boss fights where you find yourself locked in a small area with the boss and his goons ready to beat you up. Boss fights are a bit of a mixed bag. There's quite a few of them and mostly play the same way. You damage them while avoiding their attacks and dealing with any mobs. The only way in which they differ gameplay wise, other than their attacks, is in the arenas you fight them in. And some stand out while others are just straight up frustrating. There are a couple of combat sections that need a little tweaking, because they walk the line between challenging and frustrating way too much and end up stepping on the wrong side more often than not. Frustrating as they might be, I never really reached Dark Souls levels of exasperation in any of the game's sections. Only repeating the hardest bits between 5 or 7 times before finally getting it right. Your arsenal is one of the things that makes combat quite interesting. As like I mentioned before, it is far removed from the usual array of rifles and machine guns that we are more than used to. Using weapons at first feels a little clunky, thanks in no small part to a strange weapon selection method, more reminiscent of an action-adventure game than a shooter. There is an option to make cycling through weapons more immediate, and I very much recommend you toggle it. Aside from that, you immediately notice that every weapon fills a sort of role in your inventory. Some of them are good all around, like your trusty bow and arrow, while others get more specific. You might have 3 different crossbows, but they are all useful for different situations and have drastically different behaviors from one another. There is also no melee of any sort. This is a shooter through and through. Found a sword or an axe, you're gonna be throwing that shit. Along with ammunition for your weapons and quest items to progress the story, scattered around the levels are potions that come in 4 different flavors. Green ones heal you by a set amount, purples serve as medkits that you can carry around for later use, orange increases your carry capacity, and finally red increases your max health. Red potions also serve as a form of collectible, since you get a reward near the end of the game if you find many of them. This game does a great job in balancing its whimsical escapade nature with the more dangerous aspects of a trip through uncharted lands. The whole experience is crafted to maintain a need to continue your adventure and see it all the way through. Say the game just put you through a difficult enemy encounter or boss fight. It is likely that you won't be doing that again for a little while. There are levels that are very dangerous, levels that are mostly about exploration, and even one particular level that is all about the scenery. Some parts of the game are also pretty stressful, using the full potential of the soundtrack, enemy design, and the unique gameplay elements of each level. In my case, when I first started this adventure, I didn't think that among the many things this game would throw at me, underwater spelunking would be a thing, but here we are. Also, don't think you're safe from spiders just cause you're underwater. If there was a genre of games called nope simulators, Northern Journey would surely be among them. Nope. What? No. No. Just no. Honestly, this game might be an FPS, but if you rearrange the letters real quick, you can discover its true nature. Pretty fucking spooky.
Okay.
All of these things add to the game's excellent pacing. None of the levels are boring, none of the sections feel repetitive, and no gameplay mechanic overstays its welcome. Yes, there are a couple of frustrating bits, but nothing you can't get through by persevering, which I would argue is part of any great adventure. And its greatest strength is precisely that it was conceived as such. A simple concept that isn't trying to be groundbreaking, just very good. And it achieves that and more. When I say that this game helped me recover my faith in video games, it is because it reminded me of why I personally play them. As I grew older and started having less time for myself in general and for gaming in particular, my taste in games changed. I slowly began to put myself in a box and only played titles that gave me immediate and tangible satisfaction. Add to that the fact that AAA gaming, or at least some of its most recognizable franchises, are in a sorry state or slowly headed that way, and it's enough to make you feel that games are not for you anymore. It's been a while since I played a game just for the sake of playing it, with no narrative, gameplay, or cosmetic reward to drive me to the end credits. In the case of Northern Journey, I just wanted to see more of it. To me, that makes this experience the very definition of adventure. Also, you exit one of the levels via a massive slide. 10 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing for more game reviews and other stuff. I have to go now. There's a spider in my room.